Welcome to the Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Mathews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from the complexity of development to the art of resistance, from colonial histories that haunt us to reimagining futures. We return after an extended summer break where we had an exciting season of Arcs, a sci-fi podcast hosted by my colleague Anjali Alapat. For the rest of the season, we will introduce you to some exciting guests speaking on topics related to Earth. To kick us off after our break, my guest is Aseem Shrivastava, a writer, teacher, and ecological thinker with a doctorate in economics from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He is a widely published author and has offered courses on global and Indian ecosophy at Ashoka University. One thing that drives his work and thought is a dialogue with the ecological challenges of 21st century global modernity. From Hannah Arendt to Rabindranath Tagore, his work is inspired by a range of philosophers, poets, and thinkers, all adding to a rich textured take on the metaphysics of life and how we approach the ecological and other crises we face. Please do give this episode a listen, as Aseem speaks so well and so passionately about these topics. There's a quiet wisdom to his words, so much deep reflection, and more. Importantly, he radiates a real calm which is rare in an often crazily scary, cruel, noisy world. Aseem, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the Subverse.
Thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure.
I wanted to start with a recent book that I read. It's called Geologic Life, and it's written by Catherine Youssef, who was one of our guests in the podcast this season. And in the book, she writes, "There is no ground but the earth." It really struck me as such a simple and elegant phrase, and equally a remarkably deep and profound statement of fact. There is no ground but the earth. Can you tell us how, in your own work, writing and thinking, why an earthly view is important and even necessary to deal with the polycrises we face, whether it be climate-related, biodiversity, or habitat-related, and even in the economic, political, and financial realms?
Right. Well, I think the most important thing to begin with is that this is an existential crisis. This is not an intellectual crisis or merely a crisis of culture. It is all those things as well. And I'll come to that a little later as to what the connections are between the different layers or levels of crisis that modern culture and civilization are experiencing at the moment. It's a much more fundamental, foundational upheaval in human affairs. When it's an existential crisis, the first thing you need to do is look at where your feet are. So the lives we are actually living with these bodies, with this biological organism, and the soul as it lives through this body, the intellect as it lives through this body, has a certain location, has a certain place time associated with it. It's not decontextual like so much of the virtual world in which we live now is. So when it comes to something like an existential crisis, and you consider the fact that your feet are in a world which is physically unsustainable, and that what can't go on forever will not go on forever, then you really have to sit up and ask yourself very fundamental questions about not only how we got here, but also what does it mean? And unless we ask those questions, we're not going to get to the bottom of the whole pile of problems, which is that I think the meaning of life itself is lost today. Why are we here? What are we doing? Are not abstract philosophical questions. They're very real questions, and they are being answered, whether you and I may like the answers or not, but they are being answered in one or another way, more or less perverse. as per the dictates of the global market and the way the global market has organized human societies and cultures for its own ends. So, unless we are willing to ask the question about the meaning of life, and unless we are willing to see this as a fundamental crisis in modern cosmology itself, and here I'll refer to the work of Raymond Panikkar, the Spanish philosopher, Indo Spanish, I should emphasize, philosopher theologian, who uses the term cosmology with a K as distinct from cosmology with a C. So one is a sign and the other is a symbol. Cosmology with a K is a symbol. So indicating that this cosmology with a K is the one in crisis today. And the reason why it is in crisis is because the only worldview which we have today is the cosmology with a C, which is a scientific or a technological cosmology, or a technocratic cosmology to be more precise. And it is this which is actually in a kind of terminal crisis, in my view. And I think it has been generated in a city driven metropolitan vision of progress, which looks upon all life in the countryside and the jungles as backward and so on. So, as you move from the countryside to the city, you also make a journey in time from the past to the future. And so there's a sort of a metropolitan telos, if you will, in which everybody's imagination is caught. And I would like to propose that this is a destructive, dangerous delusion, and which needs to be addressed in all sorts of urgent ways, right up front and center. And the way I see, all this in relation to the earth and the statement which you quoted, which I think is so obvious and yet so hidden from our view. And we have to ask ourselves, why is the obviousness of such a statement hidden? Why isn't it obvious that the earth is the only ground on which you stand? Because most of the time we are living out of our heads and we're living out of an imagination which is actually, shall we say, cosmologically speaking, expatriate. You know, we're looking at the earth from the outside in an image such as the globe. And I think there are two or three key events of the modern age which play into everybody's perception and cognition here. One is the planetization of the earth, as I call it. Now, the Earth is not just another planet. It may be for abstract science, but for human beings, animals, plants, other species who live and thrive on Earth and only on Earth, it is not just another planet. But this is not understood nowadays. The assumption is that everybody is with the scientific cosmology in which the Earth is just one more planet. And as Elon Musk would say, or even Stephen Hawking would say, we are a multiplanetary or an interplanetary species, you know. And that's a nice sort of attractive lure, but really it's a sort of schoolboy fantasy when it comes to hard realities of life. So, the planetization of the Earth, ever since the sort of mapping of the solar system by astrophysics and so on, has been terribly useful, of course, in our scientific understanding of things. But when taken literally, as in pictures of the Earth from the moon or from space, being mistaken for the Earth itself, in other words, the scientific cosmology becoming the mythos or the cosmology with a K in which we come to live, then we literalize an interpretation of reality which is terribly dangerous, simply because of the power of science and the power of myth combined in this one cosmology, which is then inflicted with great confidence upon the entire earth. So I'll give you one example of the sort of danger you quote here. Hannah Arendt, among others, but primarily it was Hannah Arendt who pointed out back in the 1950s that virtually all of modern science is no longer natural science. It is actually what she calls universal science. So she says whether we carry out experiments in a test tube to trace the processes of cosmic evolution, or we look at the processes of thermonuclear reaction happening only on the surface of the sun, we are actually studying the universe as a whole, and we are applying universal laws not only to the rest of the universe but also to Earth. And we are saying that the Earth is a special case of a wider general story about the universe. So, for instance, thermonuclear reaction happening on the sun, which is fusion to astrophysicists, is then experimented with in the laboratory of Earth. The Earth is translated into a laboratory, right? In philosophical terms, this is a category error. You know, a laboratory should be a subset of the Earth, not a superset. And the Earth is not a laboratory, but you're using it as a testing ground and in the process transforming the object itself, which is to say the Earth. It's also, in some strict sense, anti scientific what you're doing when you're doing hydrogen bomb tests in the Marshall Islands in the South Pacific, as they've been doing since the early 1950s. So, with this kind of earth alienation, as she calls it, and she says that we have literalized the Archimedean point. Archimedes, remember the Archimedes story. He says, give me a place to stand to his king in ancient Greece, and I will move the earth. Give me a place to stand and a crowbar, and I will move the earth. It was an imaginative experiment, a thought experiment, which has then become the sort of epistemic fulcrum, if you will, of most of modern science. And we are constantly trying to stand outside ourselves as individuals, as communities, as cultures, as a species, to look at ourselves from the outside. So we've got so used to looking at the Earth from the outside in that very attractive lunar image or space age image from 1960s onwards, that we've forgotten that there is a living earth which we owe our existence to and to which we belong. We lost our sense of belonging to Mother Earth in exchange for a promise to be able to travel into better places in the future. It might be the outer galaxies or Saturn or some place like that. Are we in a position to make such an exchange? Is this something worth thinking about? So, that is one of my key tropes in thinking about the Earth, and the Earth being the only ground on which everything stands, not only existentially, but also ideally, cognitively, intellectually, philosophically, spiritually, and so on.
Aseem, thank you so much. And thank you for that introduction. When you were speaking, especially about planetization, looking for other planets to colonize or explore, I was reminded of William Shatner, Captain Kirk from Star Trek. And when he had made that visit in 2021 with the Blue Origin space shuttle, and I quote him because he wrote about it when he came back. He thought that going into space would be the next beautiful step to understanding the harmony of the universe. Instead, he discovered that the beauty isn't out there, it's down here with all of us. Leaving that behind made my connection to our tiny planet even more profound, he writes. And he then goes on to write, and I found this so striking. He said it was among the strongest feelings of grief I have ever encountered. The contrast between the vicious coldness of space and the warm nurturing of Earth below filled me with overwhelming sadness. And I think coming from somebody who played a space explorer, I found this really, really striking.
It is. And I went and read an extract from that text after you shared the story with me. And what is particularly striking and important is that here is somebody who acted out the role on celluloid and therefore in fantasy, knowing it to be fantasy. And then, if the fantasy were to come true, that is to say, actually taking a journey into space, courtesy Jeff Bezos, whoever, he finds himself sad and in a most unexpectedly sorrowful mood about what it means to go into space. So, this adventure is wonderful in the mind, but actually carried out existentially means something else. So, for an actor to actually come to admit or acknowledge that or reveal that is, I think, very, very important. I think that people have got too carried away, not just the lay public, but the experts themselves, the scientists, the technologists, the engineers, the technocrats, the policy wonks, the people who actually do all the hard work of putting, for instance, a space vehicle together, or commissioning the project, or whoever are the big decision makers. They, of course, have a certain vested interest in making sure that projects proceed and so on. But again, once you try to literalize every fantasy, then someone somewhere is whispering in someone's ear, "Fools go where angels fear to tread." These are the kind of things, for instance, which Leonardo da Vinci, of all people, back in the 15th century, was warning about. With all his prowess as an engineer and as an artist and as a scientist, he was warning about the excesses of technology and where it can lead humanity, the terrible places it can take humanity. So I think that the mistake that is repeatedly happening is exactly of looking at things outside in. But there is also, and I want to draw attention to two other processes of modern cognition, or cognitive modernity, as I like to call it, which I think are important to relate to this. One is the globalization of the world. Okay. The world was not always global in the sense in which it is today. And the other, and I'll come to this in a minute, is the objectification of the human body. The body is Earth, and we fail to give enough respect to ourselves if we do not heed that and notice that. And we bully the body in all sorts of ways for public performances, whether in sports or in some form of art, or various modern adventures involve the bullying of the body, which presumes a certain objectification, as though the body doesn't have a natural somatic cognition of its own, as though a soccer player's feet or knees do not already know what they are to do, quite independent of the mind. You know, if the mind had to intervene at every step, he wouldn't be a great soccer player. And the same is true of a great dancer or a musician. So many different human activities are, involve the sort of somatic intelligence of the body. And this whole mind body problem that existed since the age of Descartes is, to my mind, a terrible, terrible distraction from the unity in which we must see both these things. But coming to the globalization of the world, I just want to say one more thing in this context, which is how economics and modern political economy have come to see nature as a resource, resting their assumptions on the prior scientific assumption. It's a metaphysical assumption in some fundamental way, which is that nature is only matter. There is no mind, there is no psychic aspect, there is no spiritual aspect, and so on. Now, philosophers have been doubting this for millennia. Okay, and today you have panpsychists and panentheists and all sorts of philosophical sort of schools which are trying to explore, some of them quoting quantum physics on their side, to show that nature is a lot more than matter, or not mere matter, and so on. But even if you were to look at nature as matter, and this is an important etymological point, the origin of the word matter is mater, which is mother. Now, that's the origin of matter. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you something about the way even matter has been understood in the past as a personification, as having a life, as having some degree of autonomy, agency, whatever modern word you want to give it. There was a time when, as Arendt points out in her book, we were living on an earth which was, together with the sky, one in the experience of humanity. There were problems, of course, there have always been problems. There was exploitation, there was injustice, and so on. But ecologically, this was one place. That unity of place has been lost now, and earth has been sundered from sky to the point where there is, as she says, man versus the universe. Not just man versus nature, not just man versus the earth, but man versus the universe. And so this brings about a degree of alienation which is of cosmic proportions. So the earth alienation actually generates levels of alienation which actually sunder humanity, not only from the earth, but from itself, which is to say, it causes alienation in our relationships to others, it causes alienation in our relationships to ourselves, our self recognition is misplaced. And what I think of as the triple alienation, alienation from self, alienation from culture, alienation from nature. This triple alienation is a legacy of reason, science, and progress as the Enlightenment, European Enlightenment, has taught the world. And it is also the thing which has led to what I call the three disturbed ecologies of modernity, which is nature, culture, and the self.
We'll be back after a break. Aseem, if we could speak a little bit more about this relationship with nature. In an article that you wrote in the Open magazine in 2021, you start the article by writing, "Without nature, we are not." And in that article, then you go on to also speak about the earth and the earth having dreams for us. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about this.
You see, we come from a culture, which is to say India, Asia, the Orient in general, where the universe is meant to have a soul. It's not just humanity which has a soul. Rabindranath in Sadhana, I think, says quite clearly that the big difference between metaphysics in the East and the West is that in cultures of the East, the universe has a soul. In cultures of the West, only humanity has a soul. Remember, he's writing 100 years ago. Today, most of the Western world, and most of the modern world, doesn't believe in the soul anyway. So even in humanity, the soul has made an exit because you actually fail to see that there is a soul in the world which is supposed to be out there only. So this understanding of reality of the world as being something out there is at the very root of the cognitive crisis. If you begin to notice the tree, the stirring of leaves in a breeze, or if you begin to notice the flight of birds carefully, their nesting habits, or if you look at the rumbling of streams or meandering rivers, or if you look at the different moods of rivers, there are rivers which you and I will agree are angry, and there are rivers which you and I will agree are depressed, and there are rivers which you and I will agree are happy. There is a certain objectivity to it. It's not like, they're not communicating. The language is non-verbal. Now, if you come from a culture where in the beginning is the word, then you will miss that language. In the beginning is something else. The word comes at the end. Language comes at the very end of human cognition. So there's a lot that is pre-discursive, that is pre-analytic, pre-discursive processes of cognition which are happening in plants, in animals, even in so-called dead matter, rocks and so on. And physicists will tell you that. A large amount of work now exists in the sciences, in botany, in zoology, in various subdisciplines of biology, which actually go to show just how much life, how much animateness, or how much liveliness there is in the rest of creation. Human beings don't have any monopoly on life. So it's a living earth, and ecosophy, in some ways, is the wisdom not only of the earth but of the living earth, which doesn't mean that a part of the earth is dead. We actually do not know that. And dead matter is not a very helpful concept beyond a point. I mean, the distinction between the living and the dead itself is sometimes not clear. So I would rather put away these binaries and think in a continuum, you know, from, let's say, deadness to livingness or something like that. We are at different points on the continuum, and the continuum is not linear either. I mean, everybody has experienced this. Dogs can smell much better than humans. Even the police will agree with you. Birds, know their sense of direction much better than us. They know exactly how to traverse continents. So there are intelligences that are there on Earth which are different from ours. They're not even comparable to ours. It's up to you as to whether you are smart enough to know how smart animals are or plants are or so on. Just because you can kill them doesn't make you superior to them. A virus kills humanity doesn't make the virus superior to humanity. So power is not the essence of truth. Something else is. Let's find out what that is. But that's not the way science has developed since the days of Francis Bacon. The whole project from the beginning has been imbued with power and control and domination of nature and the conquest of nature. Rabindranath makes a profound distinction between truth and fact. He says facts are things we know, truths are things we feel. A difference, you know. So, in making the kind of statement which you quoted earlier, my thought was that what is called animism sometimes, or panpsychism, or panentheism, or pantheism, various schools of philosophical thought which sort of take this into account. If we actually begin to delve into that realm, and if we actually experience nature afresh, which is to say, with the potential that you're looking at one form of the soul when you're looking even at a dragonfly, you know, what happens to you? And is there some kind of communication happening at a completely metaphysical level between you and the dragonfly, or between you and even a cloud? Is that possible? And should that be possible, is it fair to then take Rilke's poem Elegy in Duino Elegy seriously and ask ourselves, could the earth have dreams for us? Because if the earth is a living one and we are merely apparitions or forms or manifestations, if you will, of some much deeper consciousness of which we have only limited awareness, then the fault might be on our side in not noticing that somebody is secretly guiding your life through some invisible ecology which is not accessible to your knowledge systems just yet, you know. So hence wisdom of the living earth, and hence becoming less ignorant of our ignorance. So knowledge has been given way too much priority, and the vast extent of human ignorance at the individual, collective, species level is just ignored, you know, as though one fine day, sometime in the future, everything will be known. That's the illusion. It'll never happen. It'll never happen. Only because reality is not like that. My sense is that whatever we say something is, there's always something more and something different. And we are normally lost in the world of our interpretations, and we lose sight of the fact that reality is always, always, always much greater than what our language is able to access or communicate.
Here, I also wanted to ask, I mean, how do these approaches differ, let's say, from modern day environmentalism or ecological approaches?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I think it's very important to understand that the two dominant approaches which exist to discuss and understand the ecological crisis, one is environmentalism and the other is ecology. Now, ecology is a science. It is a step better than a purely materialistic science, which does not necessarily get into, you know, issues of interdependence or interrelationships between organisms and their environments, and is more reductionist generally. So ecology is an advance on that, but it remains a science. And environmentalism is a perspective which sometimes serves as ideology for a corporation which wants to do, you know, a public relations campaign in which it wishes to appear green, or a government with the same bent of mind, while conserving certain structural features of the way decisions are made and the way the system runs. They're not willing to question structural avarice and things like that. They're only willing to allow for changes at the edges, and the environment is almost an afterthought to the economy. That's the way most economists are trained to think. I was trained as an economist, so I do know this. So, an environmental vision thinks of things which are merely out there and have less to do with us. It's a more or less technocratic vision, and with the implicit belief that technology will solve every problem that keeps coming up. And despite the evidence, not willing to believe that solutions are always lagging behind problems or are creating new problems which are even more intractable more complex, more insidious, and so on. I mean, take a simple piece of evidence. Over the last 30 years, since, let's say, the Rio Conference in 1992, the UN Conference on Environment, over the last 32 years, the proportion of our global energy consumption, which comes from renewables, remains at 20%. It was 20% then, it is 20% now. No progress effectively in the proportion, let alone the absolute amount, which is the one which is actually important for climate change and other things, even exhaustion of fossil fuels. So we've really made no progress in these 32 years. In fact, we have regressed a lot. So despite the obvious problems with what I call solutionism, it is not surrendered. And this is part of modern environmentalism. So Ecosophy comes with a big critique of sustainability. Sustainability is actually a terribly dangerous idea because it gives us the illusion, public illusion, that something is being done about. We are aware of the problem, we are handling it, we have it under control. No, you don't. Sustainability is all about extraction. How much can we go on taking from the earth without fundamentally changing anything about the way we live and think, right? And the word environment, which I believe comes from French originally, environ referring to one's surroundings, that which surrounds us. To that extent, ecology is an improvement in environmentalism because at least it talks about the oikos, which is the origin of the word ecology. So oikos referring to the Greek word for home, right? So at least you're willing to talk about the home, and in some sense, the sort of the science of the home, the understanding you have of the home is what ecology refers to, literally, technically speaking. So you already see some difference, which is that in the one case, you're talking about what is the home, and in the other case, you're talking about what surrounds the home. So there's already a difference between ecology and environmentalism. Ecosophy takes it one step deeper, which is to say the problem is not just out there, the problem is not just in our interrelationships and our lack of understanding of interdependence and so on. It's also with us. There's a problem in culture. There's a problem in the human psyche today. So, unlike both environmentalism and ecology, which ecosophy doesn't have actually scientific pretensions, it is experiential, not based on experiments, not based necessarily on easily verifiable experience or easily demonstrable evidence, but evidence all right. And that has to be taken seriously, whether or not it meets the criteria of a particular science. So that's one, that it's personal and experiential in a way in which neither ecology nor environmentalism are. At the other end, it's cosmological. It challenges the prevailing cosmology of modernity in the most general, dominant sense. Neither environmentalism nor ecology fundamentally tackle things like earth alienation. Neither of them is actually looking at the content of our vanishing relationship to the natural world in its full physical and metaphysical depth. You have to get there. You have to get into that to realize what has been lost, what conquest of earth, what earth alienation, what this entire mythos has meant for humanity. I don't think ecology and environmentalism have the perspective to actually develop the tools with which you can understand what is happening. So that's the second thing, the earth alienation bit, the fact that ecosophy challenges modern cosmology in a fundamental way. We need a new mythos, says Panikkar, and I completely agree. Somebody like Tagore has a mythos. His mythos is very, very clear. When you read his poetry, his music, his stories, his plays, his letters, the mythos is all there. The meaning of life is intact. He's not a scientist. He doesn't need to go to science to find the meaning of life. And that's why truth is different from fact. The cosmology of modernity has to be faced because, in my humble reckoning, it is that which is causing the mess and will go on contributing to it till we wake up to the fact that the cosmology is in terminal crisis, putting us in terribly endangered circumstances as a consequence. So, these three things I would say: the personal aspect in which nature is to be understood, the experiential dimension, and the cosmological outlook. In all these three things, ecosophy is radically different from both environmentalism and ecology. Now, when I mention the personal aspect, something strikes me. Panikkar uses a very interesting word. He talks about arrythmia. Arrhythmia is a concept from cardiology, from medicine, right? And it's when the heart skips beats or there are palpitations or the heart is out of rhythm. Panikkar's simple idea is that just like the heart is out of rhythm, too many things on earth might be out of rhythm. But I think this is what has to be followed up. And I'm trying to work on this, one of my next books, which is to speak of ecosystems suffering from arrhythmia. So when you have rhododendrons in the Himalayas flowering in December or January, you have arrhythmia. You have a problem. You have 60-hour long cloudburst in the month of October or November in Uttarakhand. That's a huge anomaly. That's arrhythmia. And like that, there is arrhythmia in culture. So cultures and communities have been thrown completely off kilter in order to ensure the triumph of the global market. And not only culture, but in the process, human psyches have been deeply disturbed. So you have psychic or cognitive or spiritual arrhythmia. So this would be my way of visibilizing the imbalances which the ecological crisis entails. So remember the three disturbed ecologies I mentioned at the level of the self, at the level of culture, at the level of the earth. All three levels, the ecologies are disturbed. I find it difficult to meet a person today who is not in a crisis or who is not a crisis in themselves.
Thank you so much, Aseem. And I love this term, arrhythmia. I think it's a really interesting way to kind of look at these issues. And it's also something you mentioned earlier about the body and earth, of how they're connected. Even internally, the proportion of water we have in our body, the proportion of water we have on earth, they're not imaginary ratios.
Yeah, yeah. That's right. That's right.
Something that you wrote really struck me, and I think it also fits so much with the theme that we're discussing, which is where you talk about earth movers replacing earthworms. I wonder whether we could end with that, which is this replacing of earthworms with earth movers. And what does that mean for the earth? Not just for the soil, which is so important, but if you could end with that image, that metaphor, and if you could also then give us some parting thoughts that we could share with our guests.
Well, I would like to lean on Rabindranath to answer your question and to give a nice rounding off to the conversation. So, I'm working on a book which will hopefully see the light of day in the next few years. It's called For Love of the Earth. And it's about modernity, Ecosophy, Rabindranath Tagore. That's the subtitle. For many, many years, I've been reading him, and he's been a big influence in shaping so much of my thinking. And to my mind, he's actually the first ecosopher, so to speak, in modern times, who actually foresees the full scale and gravity of the ecological crisis in full. He says in The Religion of the Forest, which is one of his finest tracts written in his 40s or 50s, that when a man does not realize his kinship with nature, he lives in a prison house whose walls are alien to him. So trust a poet to come up with this rather than somebody else. And any number of texts from Rabindranath I could quote to show you just how deeply he felt that his own well being, his own soul, his own bliss was tied to the destiny of the natural world around him. He also admits at the same time that he is ignorant and that there is no way he would not be. And sometimes ignorance is a wonderful thing also. So he says, for instance, in I think one of his letters from Shantiniketan, he says that when I try to emulate my boys in walking barefoot, I painfully realize the thickness of my ignorance about the earth and what I carry under my feet. And he says that robbing the child of his earth is to teach him geography or to teach him grammar in the place of language is actually an injustice. There are any number of poetic statements that come out of his protagonists and characters play like Muktadhara, which is fabulous. The theme of that play is about how the liberation of humanity and the liberation of nature go together. They're not separate. So for me, the big takeaway from reading so much of Rabindranath has been to understand the nature of human freedom as a fundamentally ecological phenomena, something that is entirely missed out by Enlightenment philosophy. The whole European Enlightenment philosophy is based on conquest of nature. The people in the Enlightenment tradition who actually were constantly trying to remind the big scientists and philosophers about the importance of nature were what are called the romantics, the poets, whether it's Keats or Shelley or Wordsworth or Blake or in Germany, Goethe, and so on. But the idea that nature is actually not your source of resources and not mere matter, but it actually shows us a mirror. To Rabindranath, that holds the possibility of a liberating communion in a way that we will not be able to free ourselves ever if we are not willing to free the natural world from our clutches. So, I mean, could it be that the Earth's ecological crisis is actually a consequence of the fact that we've been taught to mistake power for freedom? That we began to think about the conquest of nature as our way to freedom? Even Comrade Marx used to believe that, by the way. So, subjugation of nature is very deep in the Western tradition. And those, like the romantics I mentioned, who wanted to show a different path, were banished into, the mists of time. So Rabindranath tells an audience in Japan, I think around 1916, on one of his first visits, that dominating nature from the outside is a lot simpler than making her your own in love's delight, as he calls it, which is a work of true genius, he says. So that whole perspective has to now return. And I think it's an imperative. It's not only an ecological imperative, it's an existential imperative for humanity to surrender a worldview which has been enormously successful but equally destructive. And so, in that sense, paying attention to the fine print, the granular detail, which is to say the earthworm, is a lot more important than being very impressed with these giant JCBs and earth movers, which can change the physiognomy of the earth in a few hours, And we should worry about the scale of destruction that these machines are capable of. I was in Bangalore some years back. I remember giving some lectures at Aseem Shrivastava University, and on the way, this was on the highway to Chennai, which is where the university was located. Over several miles, I saw these grandma banyans reduced to stump, scores of them. So these are banyans which must have been planted God knows how many decades or centuries ago and reduced to stump because the Bangalore motorists with their SUVs and their Mercedes, they want to speed on 8-lane expressways and they feel they can replace the banyan forest with a better one somewhere. This kind of childish thinking is what is driving development in India, and it'll destroy India. I'm quite convinced that development will destroy India if we don't wake up. So maybe I should just say this and then close. He talks about something called Chotto Vedana. So what is Chotto Vedana? Chotto Vedana in Bengali and Sanskrit refers to repentance, atonement from the heart, what Panikkar would call, using Western theology, as metanoia, a radical metanoia. And what does it mean? It means atoning for the rape of the earth that has gone on over these centuries. And this kind of industrial disrobing of the earth, as I like to call it, is not just disrobing the earth, it's disrobing ourselves, it's losing our freedom, bringing things to an end. So I think we need that Chotto Vedana to actually realize what we are doing. And otherwise, we're not getting out of this.
Thank you so much, Aseem. I think we've ended with love and atonement. So I think that's a great way to end this conversation.
Thank you. My pleasure. It was an honor.
Thanks to Aseem Shrivastava for sharing his thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. So long, and thanks for listening.